for all of you in this space to talk with one another, to pose questions to one another, to share practices with one another, and to be fully engaged with one another as we co-construct this knowledge today around anti-racist online pedagogies. So my name is Amara DeCure. I am affiliated with the School of Education. I'm a professorial lecturer there. And this year, I have the pleasure of serving as CTRL's inaugural Inclusive Pedagogy Fellow. And I'm so excited that my co-fellow, Christina, is also joining on this session this morning. My work with CTRL over these past 2 years is focusing on advancing anti-racist pedagogies across our AU campus. And so it's with the goal and the theme of a really good professional conference session that I am bringing to you these ideas that I am coming to organize for myself and practice communicating these with a faculty community. So I welcome your feedback, your critical feedback, your comments, your questions, your revisions to my 10 habits in an effort to help me make these more meaningful for the work that we're doing on our campus and on other campuses as well. And to prepare for this session, I was very intentional about naming and titling this session in a way to try and communicate what I'm hoping we will accomplish. So if you don't mind, just give me a few moments just to describe what I mean by the individual words in this title. 1, I start with the number 10 habits. And the reason I'm naming this as 10 is because 10 is a very clear and finite number that we can consider establishing as our AU professional expectations. If this session goes well, then we can collectively agree at the end of the hour that these habits are the ones that we truly want to prioritize. Then remembering them as a group of 10 may help hold each of us accountable to sustaining this work. Next, I have the word habits. And I put this word intentionally because I don't have the plan to present to you any one-up elements that you're going to simply insert into your syllabus or name as comments that you should describe and project on the first day of class the week after next. I'm hoping to present these truly as habits that should be developed and curated over time. And I'm making a commitment to you that these habits are ones that I have been constructing in my classroom for years and have been taking the effort to translate these habits to doing work in the online classroom. So then I have to move to online classroom, right? Because this is where most of us are teaching yet again for another semester. And it's because this is where most of our students are learning yet again for another semester as we enter the year 2021 in what I'm counting as my 11th month of quarantining at home. But then we have to move to that middle word. And this is the word through which our entire session should pivot. And this is the term of humanize. All right. And I don't mean to suggest by naming this title of this session, I don't mean to suggest that there's anyone in this space or anyone on campus that would ever assume that our students are not human. All right. Humanizing for our conversation today is not going to mean acknowledging someone's biological classification as a human being. All right. I'm defining humanizing today as an active verb, meaning to validate another's humanity. Active because this is ongoing work, deliberate work, and work that's truly actionable. From what I know to be true, to validate another's humanity means to validate another person's right to feel and to be and to express themselves whenever and however they show up. If we validate another's humanity, then we're validating another person's lived experiences and their cultural knowledge as a source of meaning and relevance in their lives. And when we validate another person's humanity, we're validating another person's desire for comfort, for belonging, and for love as an essential component to their well-being. And we recognize that others are full and complex individuals, deeply connected to their family, their friends, their partners, their communities, their passion projects, their ideologies, their values, and their beliefs. So my assertion to you in this next hour is that if we establish habits to humanize one another in our online classrooms, we will embody a core principle of anti-racist pedagogy. So Lindsay or Sherry, just give me a heads up. Is this a good time when we can launch poll number 1?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. So if humanizing the online classroom is about validating the humanity of the members in our classes, then I invite you to answer this poll question in front of you to the best of your ability. What is your greatest motivator for humanizing your online classroom? And then Sherry, whenever you see that maybe, I don't know, 75% or so of the people in the room have had a chance to vote, then you could end the poll and project the results. Perfect. So most of us check this first indicator here. Students will have an increased sense of belonging. And the one that follows it, students will have a greater level of achievement. These two motivators are tied together, all right? Because humanizing fosters an instructor-student and student-student relationships in our classrooms by intentionally supporting non-cognitive components of learning, all right? Presence, empathy, awareness. These are essential to the learning process. And when a student has a sense of belonging, it removes any psychological barriers that they may have in that learning space. And many of these barriers are held by marginalized students because they experience harm in many of their college classrooms. So for those of you that checked either the first or the second motivator, yes, you are absolutely right. These are strong motivators for the humanization work for our online classrooms. And for those of you that check the third and the fourth indicator, disrupting inequities present in your class, or you identify as an anti-racist educator, yes, yes, those are strong motivators for humanizing our online classroom. Because when we do this work, we provide an equitable learning experience for all of our students. And as the instructors in our class, we have a responsibility to disrupt these inequities present in our classroom. This work is an attribute of being an anti-racist educator. So yes, if you are tethering your response and your motivator, excuse me, to disrupting inequities or identifying as an anti-racist educator, yes, move forward with that motivation. And then for those of you, I've got about, what do we have here? 11% of the room naming it's a professional expectation. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Here at American University, thanks to the work of Amanda Taylor and Fanta Au, we have an inclusive excellence plan that is a professional obligation to do this work. So yeah, let's be real. If you're doing this work because it's expected of you, I can work with that, all right? That can be your motivator as we move forward in this session today. So what I'd like to do is to begin by presenting to you how I am envisioning these 10 habits to humanize the online classroom. And I'm going to move through these 10 habits pretty quickly so that we can get to the second part of our session today, which is to move into some breakout rooms and have conversations around these 10 habits. I don't expect anyone to take notes on what these 10 habits are. At the end of my list of 10, I'm going to drop these 10 habits in the chat as a PDF for all of you to have access to, and CTRL is going to post this slide deck on the session website at 12:30. If you'd like to take notes, feel free to take notes on comments that are raised in the chat or comments that I may share about how to implement this work in your online classroom. All right, so if this is a good time, then let us move forward and start with habit number 1. All right, habit number 1, communicate your anti-racist priorities. This is big, right? In order to embody this habit, first you need to have and claim anti-racist priorities. This work is essential to humanizing your online classroom. It starts with naming your positionality. How do you show up in your classroom space? And it starts by naming the expectations that you're going to have for leading an anti-racist classroom this semester. If you communicate your anti-racist priorities, you establish expectations for yourself and for your students, expectations that you expect to uphold in your classroom, the humanizing of everyone in that classroom space, meaningfully centering issues of race and equity in all of your content, and confronting inequities whenever they may occur, in the classroom or outside of the classroom. Communicating your anti-racist priorities in front of your class will hold you accountable to doing this work the entire semester. I can name it as truth. It happened to me in February 2020, right before we started quarantining. A student, I've taught her now for 2 semesters, she raised her hand, spoke up in class, and said this in front of everybody in the room. She taught me in February about anti-Asian discourse that had erupted after the start of COVID-19. And this student said in front of everybody in the class, she said, Dr. DeCure, I'm telling you this because I know you will want to do something because you're an anti-racist. That's it. When you communicate your anti-racist priorities, people will hold you accountable to doing this work actionably in front of others. So I encourage you to embrace this habit and communicate it widely. Habit number 2, acknowledge the historical and ongoing impacts of systemic racism. So if you look to the images that I have on the left side, these are drawn from Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965 in Selma, Alabama. And the image that I have on the upper right side is from this summer after the murder of George Floyd. Although these images are describing anti-Black racism from the past and the future, I want you to know that this habit is describing something broad and meaningful, that we have to acknowledge historical and ongoing impacts of systemic racism because they impact our classrooms this semester. We can't think that our classrooms are absent the impacts of racism, sexism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, xenophobia. They impact our classrooms today. This historical reality explains why AU is a PWI. It explains why Black students, Indigenous students, Latinx students, and Asian students, other students of color constantly continue to describe that they experience bias and aggressions, some we call microaggressions, and discrimination in our classrooms. So acknowledging this reality is necessary to the humanization of everyone in our class. And failing to do so holds you complicit to failing to acknowledge the humanity of all of your students. Now, for those of you that may find that you are less aware of historic and systemic racism or even ongoing racism, I am throwing shouts out to our amazing librarians here on campus who have produced an anti-racist praxis subject guide that you can find on the library website. Teach yourself. Learn about historic and ongoing impacts of systemic racism because they are impacting your students today. Let's move forward. Habit number 3. Do not reduce intersectionality to multiple identities. Do not reduce intersectionality to multiple identities. Now, let's be clear. We all have identities. We have multiple identities. We all have gender. We all have an age. We all have race, ethnicities. We all have a socioeconomic class. We all have an occupation. We have identities. It is not unique to have multiple identities. Intersectionality cannot be reduced to celebrating or simply naming our multiple identities. This is a really powerful theory that describes the impacts of these multiple identities on how we experience society. The disproportionate impacts of power, marginalization, or oppression bearing down on our lives, dictated by our intersecting identities. So when I teach students in my class about intersectionality, I pull some horrible metaphors. I have, please, no offense to the mathematicians or statisticians that might be in this room, but I do make some mathematical metaphors in order to teach intersectionality to my students. I tell them it's not the sum of our differences. It's not that Greek letter sum of our differences where we're adding up our identities in order to equal intersectionality. It is a different, what I'm naming as a social, cultural, political calculation, greater than sum. Probably involves power, right? When I taught 3rd and 4th grade math, we use exponents to name power, right? So I'm going to pull in some type of exponential calculation that measures differently for each individual living in their own social context. So when you embrace the habit of acknowledging a full understanding of intersectionality, you're called to acknowledge within group differences of individuals. You can't hold implicit biases or assumptions that all people from a gender or socioeconomic class or religion or race are the same, because intersectionality would prove that to be untrue. And when you see your students on the first day of class, don't just congratulate yourself on seeing their multiple identities. That's not the hard work. The hard work is disrupting the inequitable ways in which those intersecting identities might influence those students' experiences in your class. So we have to embrace this habit of seeing intersectionality for the power that it was intended to be. Habit number 4. Rationalize the importance of your class. All right, so there are a lot of memes, a lot of jokes, a lot of caricatures of professors stepping in front of the classroom as if they are king or queen of their classroom space. All right, and when a professor speaks and when they show an effort of kindness or flexibility, it comes off as this benevolent grace that the professor is bestowing upon the class. All right, they often seek praise or admiration for their efforts. But I have a college-age daughter who shared a meme with me that was circulating last fall, and it captures why we have to embody habit number 4. The meme went something like this. It said, professors be like, these are troubled times. But why are the professors the trouble in these times? All right, we have to rationalize how important is our course in the bigger scheme of life. We have students attending our online classes navigating pandemics, multiple pandemics. So I draw your attention to the image in the middle of the screen. We have students or young people in this image protesting against a pandemic of racial injustice, but they're wearing face masks because at the same time, they're trying to safeguard their health and safety from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have to realize that our class is not just about teaching the text of our discipline. We're teaching this text within a context, a living, vibrant social context. So if we stand up in our class like this image on the left is some aloof professor naming a syllabus and pointing all the requirements of the semester, or is the image on the right just distributing a checklist of things that students have to do this semester with no attention to the context in which they are learning, then we're failing to rationalize how really important this class is. We need to be willing to revise our course requirements for online instruction at this time. Remember, people have been teaching online for years, all right? Teaching online is not new. It's why we're online that's new, all right? So we have to respond to that and rationalize that when we're setting up our expectations for our students and be willing to modify those expectations either now before classes start, in the middle when we figure out what the semester is going to present in front of all of us, or even right before finals when we realize the tension or the stress of the semester might be mounting in a very unique way for the students that we're teaching this semester. And humanizing our students also means realizing what is truly important to them this semester. Teaching in the spring means that you're going to be teaching in a semester that's going to intersect some very important religious observances for some of your students. Central to their sense of self and belonging and purpose, we have Easter, Passover, Ramadan, and Ramadan is intersecting finals week this year, right? So our ability to be flexible is a way that we embody humanizing our students in our classroom. Last fall, I was asking my class if they could help me come up with a topic for this Ann Farron conference presentation I knew I wanted to submit. And I had a student send me an email, and his advice really helped shape what I'm presenting to you today. He said, the most frustrating aspect of being in virtual classes is that the professor's mind is very different than the reality of the class. And he said he attributes it to two things. One, some professors don't take time to consider the class's emotional atmosphere. They don't take time to build any sort of relationship with their students. And given the differences in teaching in person and virtual, sometimes not all the content that the professor wanted to cover gets covered in class. It bleeds over into the next class. They add more requirements to make up the time. They change the syllabus and add more work through the semester, and it becomes overwhelming. So I call upon you, rationalize how important is your class truly in the bigger scheme of life, and teach online in a way that's meaningful for you and for your students. Which connects to habit number 5, check in regularly on our lived realities. So what I ask my students to do, and I've been doing this for semesters, I learned this at a CTRL workshop many, many semesters ago, is to start the semester by asking students to give you 10 things they want you to know about them. Now in the fall semester, I started having students, instead of writing it on a piece of paper, I started having them upload video messages for me, 10 things they want me to know about them. And one of the things should be, how do they pronounce their name, right? What pronouns do they want you to use in class with them? How are they coming and entering the start of the semester? What's important in their lives? We need this information so that we can humanize every single one of the people in our class community. I have a practice that I've started where at the beginning of every single class period, online or in person, I ask my students to share good news, something going on positive in their lives. And then I also make space for them to share something on their mind, something that may not be so good, something that's troubling them. And I tell them, just like the image on the left, sitting in a circle where we would be leaning in to listen to one another, focusing on somebody's comments, that when we're in a Zoom classroom, checking in on our lived realities, we need to make eye contact. You need to use those reaction emotions and icons, thumbs ups, anything that lets people know that we hear you, we see you, and we hear your life. But I'd like to remind you that there's some concerns that some of my colleagues have expressed that teaching students in a Zoom classroom with cameras off and mics off, how do you actually know if the students are paying attention? And so I invite you to learn, why do students have their cameras off or their mics off in class? A lot of things have been written about this online. Go and look. For sometimes the answer has to do with socioeconomic status, in-home privacy, high rates of social anxiety, Zoom fatigue, the need to multitask, childcare responsibilities, home responsibilities, a strain on their eyes physically, or simply just a persistent habit because no one else seems to care if their camera is off or on, so why should they care? For some students who have been marginalized in classrooms, it's a protection from further marginalization and bias. And for others, they realize there's no real benefit if they have their camera off or on. So if we're going to humanize everyone in our classrooms, we have to humanize everyone, even if their camera is off during our entire class session. So let's move to habit 6. I want to make sure that I'm being responsible to time. Assume responsibility for student engagement. Teaching online is challenging. I get it. It's truly difficult. If we had the time, some of you could make a whole list of all the struggles that you've had teaching online last semester and before. But the only thing more difficult than teaching online is learning online. And this is where we have to do our work. It is our full responsibility as the classroom instructor to facilitate student engagement with our course material in an online platform. Right? So today we're on Zoom and we're using the most basic structure, share my screen. But this software of Zoom can actually do a lot more, all right? And there's other softwares out there. I use Padlet in my instruction, Poll Everywhere, Google Docs, YouTube videos, anything to engage students with the love of learning. All right, and for my colleagues in here who are going to be teaching asynchronously this semester, you're not getting a pass on student engagement, all right? Even in an asynchronous class, students must be engaged to the learning process. Engage with you as a learner, engage with one another as a class community. It's your responsibility. Because when students feel a sense of belonging, a sense of community, then their achievement soars. So I invite you this semester, attend one of CTRL's workshops. Shout out to the instructional designers in this group that are able to teach you bells and whistles and new software tools that can help make student engagement so much easier in an online setting. All right, habit number 7. Authentically assess student engagement. All right, so I share this image on the left with my students. Student voice is not the same as student engagement. All right, this is not about giving A+ to anybody who puts their voice in the online classroom. There are so many ways that you can engage in authentic assessment of student engagement. You can use the chat box to assess student engagement. You can listen into breakout rooms, see who's really directing the conversation, who poses questions, who brings in others to share their opinions, who adds substance to a breakout room conversation by referencing what was assigned to read or content from a class. You can use this young man in the middle of the screen as an image of a student authentically engaged in their course material. This student here, he's reading and preparing for class, right? And then the icon on the right with the email, I've had students this past semester email me news articles, something that they've read in another class saying, Professor DeKeer, I just wanted you to see this because this connects to what we were talking about in class the other day. These are all ways to authentically assess how your students are engaged beyond just trying to hear their voice in an online classroom. All right, I'm moving to habit number 8. Now, this is a strategy that I have piloted for myself about 3 or 4 semesters ago. I'm still using it in an online space. I love this, and I encourage everyone to try hosting community office hours. This is where you take your block of office hours, you post a Zoom link, and you tell the members in your class, come and go as you please during this open community office hour time. I've actually even started sharing that link with my former students who want to come back and talk with me about other things and related to education or their own life or what have you. So this is truly a community space of students, current students and former students and myself coming together in office hours. It allows me to build community with my students in groups, informally. It creates a safer, informal space for students to ask questions about course material, preparation for a writing assignment that's coming up, or even to talk about career and college, career planning, graduate school planning, what have you. Students can address current issues, academic issues that they're facing, all in community with others. Once I realized that my previous office hours, 95% of my time was spent answering a student's question, and then the next student would come in and ask the same question, the next student would come in and ask the same question, and I realized most of the stuff is not confidential, it's not private. I was like, why am I busting my back to have a series of individual private tutoring sessions? Just throw everybody in one space and let's do this together in community and learn from one another. All right. And I feel that this centers my own humanity because it makes great time management. It does not exhaust me at the end of office hours. I actually feel rejuvenated because I've been in community with students in a small group learning space. Habit number 9, disrupt bias when and where it happens. So I'll just give you a moment to read John Lewis's quote there on the left. In order to do this work, we have to disrupt implicit bias, microaggressions, deficit thinking. These are all manifestations of bias that can occur in our classroom. For some, we are the ones who are reproducing this bias in our classroom. And so we need to make sure that we put the guardrails in our class to make sure that we get disrupted if we are reproducing bias in our classroom spaces. Others of you might be seeking to disrupt bias when it occurs student to student. But when that happens, we have resources on campus to give you guidelines, but when it happens, you have to disrupt it. It's a commitment to anti-racist pedagogy. You have to disrupt bias when you see it in your course textbook. You have to disrupt bias when you see it in any assigned readings, anything in your field of your academic discipline field where you see bias present, you have to name it and disrupt it. This has to be a habit to reproduce anti-racist pedagogy in your classroom space. And it's essential to creating a safe learning space for students who have been marginalized before they entered your classroom. If there were more time, I would invite you to learn about more of the resources for the Center for Diversity and Inclusion that we have on campus. They have great resources, and they just did a great session this morning on how to call out and disrupt bias when and where it happens. So this is a habit we must take, particularly in our online classrooms. And finally, habit 10, address contemporary issues. Even if the issue does not intersect with your academic discipline, it is not possible to teach in a social context and ignore the humanity of our students as they're trying to navigate that social context. So if this picture means something to you, and if this picture has disrupted your life this week, then if we were in class this week, you would have to call this out. You would have to address this. Even if all you do is pause and acknowledge that harm and injustice has occurred in our society. Even if you can't solve it on behalf of your students, and I don't think any of your students would expect you to do that, at least you can address it. Your students are trying to navigate their social reality, And in an online space where their college experience is limited and narrowed to just going to and from online classes, our responsibility is amplified. We must address contemporary issues. We cannot assume that students who are math or science majors are not numb to the pain of social unrest. And we can't name that students who study international affairs are not ignorant of the injustice in their neighborhoods. These students are living in their societies, and they need their societal issues to be present in their classrooms. All right, so again, this is what I am suggesting, or how I have begun to create habits for myself to humanize my online classrooms and my in-person classrooms. And I'm hoping that through this session and after this session, you'll give me some really great critical feedback on these habits. To what extent do they speak to your reality and your priority of humanizing your own online classrooms? So I'm using the time of how many minutes have we been in this session rather than the time that's on the clock. All right, so according to my top stopwatch, we have 15 minutes left in our session. And this is what I would like to invite you to do in these last 15 minutes. I'd like to invite you into a breakout room discussion. And in that breakout room discussion, you're going to be randomly assorted with about 5, 6, 7 other people in this session. And I'd like each member of the breakout room to answer this statement for themselves. As I look ahead to the spring 2021 semester, I want to prioritize, and you can either end the sentence by saying the phrase, I want to prioritize humanizing myself in front of my students, or I want to prioritize humanizing each of my students in each of my classes, or I want to prioritize utilizing technology to humanize my online classroom. All of these are valid priorities, but just take a moment and think for yourself, what is the concern that you want to prioritize for your own work as you approach this coming semester? Because of the sake of time, please forgo any individual introductions when you get into the breakout room, all right? No long-winded stories about things you've done in your class in past semesters. This is about looking forward, constructing together best practices of embodying these 10 habits of humanization by either turning the lens on yourself and the work you need to do to humanize yourself in front of students in an online space, or the work you want to do to humanize your students in an online space, or third, what technology is available to facilitate this practice in your online classroom. All right, so I'd like you to use the discussion to collaboratively strategize how you can prioritize this work. Feel free to name your challenges. This is going to be another challenging semester. So what do you foresee as a challenge to doing this work? And if you've got best practices, share them. When we come out of the breakout room, I'm going to open the chat and ask people to type into the chat any best practices that they've learned in the breakout room. And then I'm going to copy and paste the entire chat, put it into a PDF and post it to our session site after the session so that all of you have access to the best practices that will emerge from our small group conversations. Please, I invite you to refer to the 10 habits and be in community with others. Before I put you into the breakout room, I'm going to drop in here a PDF of the presentation. And Sherry, I'd like you to put everyone in the breakout rooms. So as those of you come back, I do sincerely apologize that we had a delay at the beginning of the session, and the session itself has run over some time. But before anyone leaves the space, I just ask, can you please put in the chat any best practice, any strategy, anything that you intend to take from this session forward, can you type it into the chat? And I will make the commitment to copy and paste the chat and share it with everyone at the conclusion of the session. But rather than time to be able to share out from individual groups, let's use the chat to share out. And as we do close this session, I want to thank all of you for your time and attention to this work. I want to remind you to adopt your motivations to humanize your classrooms and hold on to those motivations as you move through what might be another challenging semester. I remind you to use these habits as habits that are developed over time and take the time to develop them over the coming semesters. Lastly, my CTRL colleagues reminded me that CTRL is going to be hosting a series of conversations this spring, and I'm going to be facilitating one of them in April on a topic related to advancing anti-racist pedagogy in online classrooms. So I encourage you to come out to that session and the other sessions hosted by CTRL to continue this work. But I do encourage all of you to foster a commitment to doing anti-racist work through the habits of humanizing yourself and your classroom students in an online space. And I wish you health, safety, and peace as you move into the spring semester. And I'll see you all in the lunch session. Take care.